You want to know what humiliation tastes like? It tastes like burnt coffee and broken dreams, served up by your own flesh and blood in front of a room full of strangers who suddenly become witnesses to your destruction. When your family treats you like a background character, you learn to write your own story. But sometimes that story starts with you getting coins flipped at you like you're some kind of street performer, like you're entertainment for people who share your last name but not your values. Picture this. Morning Haven Cafe on a Tuesday morning that started like any other but ended like a knife in my chest. Steam rising from overworked espresso machines, the smell of hope and caffeine mixing in the air, the familiar chaos of people desperate for their daily fix of warmth before facing another soul-crushing day. And there I was, Ella Carter, 29 years old, coffee stains on my apron like battle scars, trying to keep it together while my world crumbled one order at a time. The cafe itself was charming but aging, like everything beautiful in this world weathered around the edges but still holding on to its dignity. Grandpa Arthur had built this place with his bare hands and his late wife's dreams, and every corner held memories that were more valuable than anything my family could ever understand. I was juggling orders, steam wands hissing, customers waiting, the morning rush hitting like a tsunami of caffeine addiction and human need. My hands were steady even though my heart was breaking, because that's what you learn when you're the family. Disappointment, you smile through the pain. You keep serving others even when your own cup is empty. Then in walks Jason, my brother, my own damn brother, in his perfectly tailored suit that probably cost more than most people make in 3 months. Corporate lawyer, they call him. But I call him a parasite in expensive clothing. He saunters in like he owns the place, which is exactly what he's been dreaming about since the day he figured out Grandpa's cafe sits on prime real estate. The way he looked around that cafe, it wasn't the look of someone visiting family. It was the look of an appraiser, a predator, someone calculating square footage and profit margins while standing in a temple of love and community. Looking a little frazzled there, sis, he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. Loud enough to make sure every customer in that cafe knew exactly what he thought of me. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a handful of coins, not bills, mind you, coins, and flipped them onto the counter like I was some kind of beggar. The sound of those coins hitting the counter still echoes in my nightmares. It wasn't just metal on wood. It was the sound of 29 years of siblinghood shattering. It was the sound of a family breaking apart in public. It was the sound of my own brother treating me like I was beneath his notice, like I was nothing more than hired help in a place that had been my sanctuary since childhood. Every single person in that cafe stopped what they were doing. Conversations died mid-sentence. Coffee cups paused halfway to lips. The entire room became a theater, and I was the unwilling star of a humiliation performance I never auditioned for. And what did I do? What does a woman like me always do? I smiled. I forced my face into that practiced expression of gratitude and cheerfulness that women learn to wear like armor. Thanks, Jason, I said, my voice steady, even though my hands were shaking. I'll add it to my therapy fund. But inside, I was screaming. Inside, I was drowning in rage so pure and hot it could have powered the espresso machine for a week. This wasn't just cruelty, this was calculated humiliation designed to put me in my place, to remind everyone watching that Ella Carter was the family failure, the one who couldn't make it in the real world, the one who had to come crawling back to Grandpa's cafe because she wasn't strong enough to survive anywhere else. The truth is, I hadn't always been behind that counter. I used to have a life. I used to have a career. I was a graphic designer at a prestigious agency in the city, pulling down 6 figures, living in a downtown apartment with exposed brick walls and floor-to-ceiling windows. I had clients who respected my work, colleagues who valued my input, a life that looked good on paper and felt hollow in my chest. But when Grandpa's longtime barista quit and his health started failing, when I saw him struggling to lift the coffee bags and his hands shaking as he counted the register at night, I made a choice. I walked away from everything I'd built to come home, and help the man who'd raised me when my parents were too busy chasing their own ambitions to notice they had a daughter bleeding for their attention. You see, Grandpa Arthur wasn't just my grandfather. He was my father, my mother, my safe harbor in a family storm that never seemed to end. When I was 8 and Jason got all the attention for winning some stupid spelling bee, Grandpa took me to the cafe kitchen and taught me how to make hot chocolate with real melted chocolate and whipped cream that wasn't from a can. When I was 16 and my parents missed my art show because Jason had a football game, Grandpa bought every single piece I'd created and hung them on the cafe walls like I was Picasso. That cafe wasn't just a business to Arthur. It was his love letter to his late wife, Ruth, the woman who'd dreamed of creating a place where the neighborhood could gather, where strangers could become friends over morning coffee, where community could happen one conversation at a time. Every morning, Grandpa would touch Ruth's picture hanging by the window and whisper something I could never quite hear. Every morning, he'd unlock that door like he was opening his heart to the world. Ruth had died 15 years ago, but her spirit lived in every corner of that place. She'd chosen the paint colors, designed the layout, picked out the mismatched chairs that somehow worked perfectly together. Grandpa used to tell me stories about their early days, how they'd saved every penny to buy that corner lot, how they'd worked 18-hour days to get the cafe running, how Ruth would stay up all night baking scones and muffins while Arthur learned to operate the espresso machine that seemed determined to fight him at every turn. Those were the stories that mattered. Those were the memories that made that cafe more than just a business. They made it a legacy. But Jason didn't care about legacy. Jason cared about profit margins and real estate values, and how much money he could squeeze out of an old man's dreams. I started noticing things after that morning. Little things. Jason would stop by more often, always when Grandpa was in the back office, always with questions about the books, about the lease, about how much business we were doing. He'd run his fingers along the counter like he was measuring it for replacement. He'd stare at the walls like he was imagining them torn down. One day, Detective Morrison, he's been a regular customer for 20 years, comes in every morning at 7:15 for a black coffee and a blueberry muffin, pulled me aside with a look of concern that made my stomach drop. "Ella, honey," he said, his voice low and careful. "Your brother's been asking around the neighborhood, asking about ownership, about property values, about your grandfather's mental state. Mental state. Like Grandpa was some kind of invalid instead of the sharpest man I'd ever known. Sure, his hands shook sometimes when he was tired. Sure, he moved a little slower than he used to, but his mind was clear as crystal, his memory sharp as a razor, his wit quick enough to cut glass. But I could see what Jason was doing. He was building a case, planting seeds of doubt, creating a narrative where Grandpa was a vulnerable old man being taken advantage of by his manipulative granddaughter. It was brilliant in its cruelty, effective in its simplicity. Then Grandpa's health took a turn for the worse. It started with little things: forgetting to eat lunch, getting dizzy when he stood up too quickly, that persistent cough that he kept dismissing as just a cold. I took over more of the morning shifts, watched him struggle with tasks that used to be second nature, saw the frustration in his eyes when his body couldn't keep up with his spirit. The day it happened, I was in the middle of the afternoon rush when I heard a crash from the kitchen. I found Grandpa on the floor, clutching his chest, his face gray as old coffee grounds. The paramedics said it was a heart episode, not a full attack, but a warning shot across the bow of mortality. And where was Jason when I called to tell him his grandfather was in the hospital? Where was my loving brother when the man who'd raised us both was fighting for his life? He was already at the hospital when I arrived, but not in the waiting room. Not holding Grandpa's hand, or whispering words of comfort. No, Jason was in the hallway with a briefcase, talking to someone on his phone about legal documents and power of attorney papers. "Once I control the estate," I heard him say, "we can close the deal by the end of the month. Once I control the estate. Not if Grandpa dies. Not in case of emergency. Once. Like it was inevitable. Like it was already decided. Like Grandpa was just an obstacle to be removed rather than a human being fighting for his life. The rage that filled me in that moment was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. It was pure and clean and sharp enough to cut through steel. This wasn't grief, this was betrayal. This wasn't concern for family, this was predatory capitalism, wearing a three-piece suit and a smile. But Grandpa was tougher than any of us knew. When he woke up in that hospital bed, his eyes were clear and focused, and when he saw Jason hovering nearby with those legal documents, something shifted in his expression. Something hardened. "Ella," he said, his voice weak but determined, "I need you to go to my office. Under the cash drawer, there's a blue envelope. Don't open it here. Take it home. Read it when you're alone." That envelope. God, that envelope changed everything. When I finally opened it in the privacy of my apartment, my hands were shaking so hard I could barely break the seal. Inside were documents I'd never seen before: property deeds, investment portfolios, bank statements that showed numbers I couldn't even comprehend. But it was the letter from Grandma Ruth that made me cry until I couldn't breathe. "My dearest Arthur," it said in her careful handwriting. "By the time you read this, I'll be gone, but our dreams don't have to die with me. The cafe is just the beginning, not the end. We've been careful, we've been smart, and we've built something that will last. Trust the one who never asked for anything. Trust the one who loves without conditions. Trust Ella." You see, Grandpa and Grandma hadn't just been cafe owners, they'd been investors. Smart, careful, patient investors who'd turned their coffee shop profits into a small empire of properties and holdings that Jason never knew existed. That little cafe that he saw as a quaint relic sitting on valuable real estate? It was actually the headquarters of a multi-million-dollar portfolio that had been growing quietly for decades. Grandpa had been playing chess while Jason was playing checkers, and I was the queen he'd been protecting all along. But Jason wasn't stupid, just greedy. When he saw me leaving Grandpa's office with that envelope, I could see the suspicion in his eyes. I could practically hear the gears turning in his calculating mind. Within a week, he'd escalated his campaign. Suddenly, Adult Protective Services was at the cafe door, asking questions about Grandpa's mental competency, about whether he was being properly cared for, about whether certain family members might be taking advantage of his vulnerable state. The social workers were kind but thorough, armed with clipboards and checklists, and the institutional authority to determine whether an 80-year-old man was capable of making his own decisions. They asked Grandpa about current events, about his medications, about his daily routines. And Grandpa? Grandpa was magnificent. He answered every question with wit and wisdom that made those social workers smile despite themselves. "Do you know what year it is, Mr. Morrison?" 2025, though some days it feels like we're going backwards. "Do you understand the value of your property? I understand that some things are worth more than money, and some people are worth less than the paper their credentials are printed on. Are you being pressured by anyone to make financial decisions? Only by a grandson who thinks inheritance is the same thing as inheritance tax, something you pay for not earning what you get." The social workers left that day with smiles on their faces and admiration in their eyes. Grandpa had passed every test, answered every question, demonstrated beyond any doubt that his mind was as sharp as it had ever been. But Jason's mask was starting to crack. I could see the frustration building, the desperation of a man who'd counted on easy money and found himself facing a much more complicated situation than he'd bargained for. That's when Grandpa made his move. He called his attorney, Margaret Chen, a woman who'd been handling his legal affairs for 20 years. I watched through the cafe window as they met at a corner table. Documents spread between them like battle plans, and I watched Jason watching them from across the street, his face twisted with rage and calculation. The next morning I found a court summons taped to the cafe door. Jason was filing for guardianship, claiming Grandpa was mentally incompetent and that I was manipulating him for financial gain. The hearing was scheduled for the following week. When I showed Grandpa the papers, He clutched his chest, and I thought for a terrifying moment that his heart was giving out again. But it wasn't pain, it was fury. Pure, righteous fury at being betrayed by his own blood. "Then we'll fight," he said, his voice steady as stone. "We'll fight, and we'll win. Because the truth has a way of rising to the surface, no matter how deep people try to bury it." The courtroom was packed the day of the hearing. Half the neighborhood showed up to support Grandpa customers who'd been coming to the cafe for decades. Employees who'd learned their work ethic from his example. Community members who understood that this wasn't just about one old man's right to control his own property. This was about whether love and loyalty meant anything in a world where everything had a price tag. Jason's lawyer was everything you'd expect: expensive suit, aggressive tactics, the kind of person who could make Mother Teresa sound like a con artist. He painted me as a desperate, manipulative woman who'd abandoned her career to isolate an elderly man from his family. He showed financial records that proved I'd been living rent-free in Grandpa's apartment above the cafe. He suggested that I'd been systematically alienating Grandpa from his own son. My lawyer, appointed by Grandpa, funded by Grandpa, loyal to Grandpa, fought back with character witnesses and medical records and evidence of Jason's financial motives. But the most powerful testimony came from Detective Morrison, who took the stand and spoke with the authority of someone who'd seen real crime and could recognize the difference between exploitation and love. "I've been coming to that cafe for 20 years, he said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute truth. "I've watched Arthur Morrison serve his community with dignity and grace. I've seen him remember every customer's order, every child's birthday, every family crisis. If that man is incompetent, then we need to redefine the word." But it was Grandpa's testimony that brought the house down. When they called him to the witness stand, he walked slowly but steadily to the front of the courtroom, placed his hand on the Bible, and swore to tell the truth with the solemnity of a man who'd never told a lie in his life. Jason's lawyer went after him hard, trying to trip him up, trying to find cracks in his memory or confusion in his thinking. But Grandpa was ready for every attack. "Mr. Morrison, do you understand that your granddaughter stands to inherit significant assets if you die? I understand that my granddaughter never asked for anything, never expected anything, and never treated me like a bank account with legs. But don't you think it's suspicious that she suddenly moved in with you and began handling your finances? I think it's suspicious that some people only show concern for family when money's involved." The lawyer pressed harder, suggesting that I'd isolated Grandpa from Jason, that I'd poisoned his mind against his own grandson. And that's when Grandpa delivered the killing blow. "Young man," he said, his voice carrying across that courtroom like thunder. "I've been watching my grandson's character for 30 years. I've seen him lie to his parents, cheat on his taxes, and treat his wife like an accessory to his ambition. The only thing my granddaughter isolated me from was the heartbreak of watching someone I love turn into someone I don't recognize." The courtroom was silent except for the sound of Jason's world crumbling. "Your Honor," Grandpa continued, "I've run a business for 40 years. I've raised 2 generations of children. I've buried a wife and survived a heart attack and built something meaningful in this community. If loving my granddaughter more than money makes me incompetent, then I plead guilty to the crime of having priorities." The judge didn't even need to deliberate. "Case dismissed," she said, her voice ringing with finality. "This petition is frivolous and insulting to everyone involved. Mr. Morrison is clearly competent, and his family would do well to remember that competency includes the ability to recognize greed when he sees it." Jason stormed out of that courtroom like a child having a tantrum, but I could see something else in his eyes. Something that looked like the dawning realization that he'd lost more than a legal case. He'd lost his grandfather's love, his family's respect, and possibly his own soul. But victories like that come with a price. The stress of the hearing, the betrayal by his own grandson, the sheer exhaustion of fighting for the right to control his own life. It all took its toll on Grandpa's already fragile heart. 3 weeks later, I found him in his favorite chair by the cafe window, Grandma's picture in his lap, a small smile on his face like he'd just heard the world's best joke. He'd died peacefully in his sleep, and somehow I knew he'd timed it perfectly long enough to see justice done, quick enough to avoid a long, painful decline. There was another envelope on the table beside him, my name written on it in his careful handwriting. The letter inside destroyed me and rebuilt me at the same time. Ella, my dear girl, by the time you read this, I'll be having coffee with your grandmother again, and she'll be giving me hell for taking so long to join her. Don't mourn too long, we had a good run, and we won the war that mattered. You've protected our legacy. Now protect your own heart. Don't let Jason's bitterness poison your future. Don't let this fight turn you into something hard and unforgiving. The world has enough angry people. Be someone who chooses love even when it costs you everything. I'm leaving you everything not because you deserve it more than Jason, but because you understand what everything really means. It's not just the money or the properties or the investments. It's the responsibility to use what you've been given to make the world a little bit better. Jason will get his inheritance too, exactly what he's earned. Maybe it'll teach him something, though I doubt it. Some people have to lose everything before they understand what they never really had. Take care of the cafe. Take care of the neighborhood. Take care of yourself. And remember, love's the only business worth staying in. All my love, Grandpa. The funeral was exactly what you'd expect. The community mourned sincerely, sharing stories about Grandpa's kindness, his wisdom, his endless capacity for making strangers feel like family. Jason stood apart from the crowd, isolated by his own choices, mourning not just a grandfather but the relationship he destroyed with his greed. The will reading was a masterpiece of poetic justice. Jason sat there in his expensive suit, confident that his legal maneuvering had positioned him to inherit everything. After all, he was the successful one, the lawyer, the one who understood money and business and how the world really worked. The attorney read through the standard legal language, then got to the meat of it. To my grandson Jason Morrison, who has confused price with value and wealth with worth, I leave the sum of $1 and a recording that I hope will teach him what 29 years of love could not. Jason's face went through every color in the spectrum as the attorney played a recording of his phone conversation outside the hospital, the one where he'd talked about controlling the estate, about closing deals, about turning his grandfather's life into a business transaction. To my granddaughter Ella Carter, who never asked for anything but gave everything, I leave the remainder of my estate, including all properties, investments, and business holdings, with the hope that she'll use them to build something beautiful in a world that needs more beauty. The remainder of his estate, $17 million in properties and investments that Jason never knew existed. The cafe was just the tip of an iceberg that Grandpa and Grandma had been quietly building for 40 years. Jason stormed out of that office with a threat on his lips. You'll regret this, Ella. But his words had no power anymore. He'd revealed himself completely, stripped away every pretense of family loyalty, shown everyone exactly who he really was beneath the expensive suits and corporate success. 6 months later, I reopened Morning Haven as Morning Haven Collective. Not just a cafe, but a community center where local artists could display their work, where seniors could get free meals, where teenagers could hang out after school and learn the same lessons about connection and community that Grandpa had taught me. I hired back all the employees that Grandpa had had to let go when business got slow. I bought new equipment, renovated the space, expanded into the adjacent storefront, but kept everything that mattered. Grandma's picture by the window, Grandpa's favorite chair, the chalkboard where he used to write daily inspirational quotes. The neighborhood came back to life. People who had been strangers became friends over morning coffee. Elderly customers started bringing their grandchildren. High school kids got their first jobs learning the same values that had built this place, that every customer deserves respect, that every interaction is an opportunity for kindness, that success isn't measured in dollars but in the number of lives you touch. I appeared on a podcast about small business success, about community building, about the difference between profit and purpose. When they asked me what Grandpa had taught me about business, I said, "He taught me coffee is just love made visible. Everything else is just details." And Jason? Jason lost everything. His job, his reputation, his standing in the community. Word spread quickly about how he'd tried to steal from his own grandfather, how he'd filed false legal papers, how he'd prioritized money over family. Corporate law is a small world, and nobody wants to hire someone who can't be trusted with their own blood relatives. But you know what the strangest part was? About 8 months after the will reading, I looked up from the espresso machine to see a familiar figure standing outside the cafe window. Jason, looking older and worn down, his expensive suits replaced with jeans and a wrinkled shirt. He stood there for a long time, just staring at the place he'd tried to destroy, at the community he'd dismissed as worthless. Finally, he came inside, quietly, humbly, with none of the arrogance that used to define him. "Could I get a coffee?" he asked, his voice barely audible. I stared at him for a long moment. This man who had tried to destroy everything I loved, who had broken our grandfather's heart, who had reduced our family to a balance sheet and found us wanting. "That'll be $3.50, I said. He fumbled in his pocket and pulled out a crumpled $50 bill. "Keep the change," he said quietly, and for the first time in years, it didn't sound like condescension. It sounded like penance. I watched him walk to a corner table and sit down, staring out the window at the street where he used to drive his expensive car, where he used to stride confidently in his tailored suits, where he used to own the world through sheer force of ambition and greed. And I realized something in that moment. Revenge isn't sweet. It's empty. It's hollow. It's watching someone you once loved destroy themselves and feeling nothing but pity and the ghost of love that used to live where anger now sits. I made him a fresh cup of coffee, the good stuff, not the regular brew, and brought it to his table. "Why?" he asked, looking up at me with eyes that were finally honest. "Because Grandpa taught me that everyone deserves a second chance," I said. "Even people who think they don't deserve it." He started crying then, right there in the middle of my cafe, surrounded by the community he'd tried to destroy. He broke down completely. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm so damn sorry, Ella. I don't know what happened to me. I don't know when I became this person." I sat down across from him, this broken man who used to be my big brother, and for the first time in years, I saw the boy who used to build blanket forts with me on rainy Sundays. "I know when," I said. "It was when you decided that having more mattered more than being more." He nodded, wiping his eyes with a napkin that had the cafe's logo on it, a simple drawing of 2 coffee cups, with steam rising between them, forming a heart. "Can you forgive me?" he asked. I thought about Grandpa, about his letter, about his belief that people could change if they wanted to badly enough. "I'm working on it," I said. "But forgiveness isn't something you can just ask for. It's something you have to earn." "How?" he asked. "How do I earn it?" I looked around the cafe, at the customers laughing and talking, at the teenagers doing homework in the corner, at the elderly man reading his newspaper while his granddaughter colored at the table beside him. "Start by remembering what family is supposed to mean," I said. "And then maybe you can help me prove that it's never too late to choose love over greed." He comes in every morning now, not as a customer really, but as someone trying to figure out how to be human again. He helps with the dishes, sweeps the floors, listens to the elderly customers tell their stories. He's learning what Grandpa tried to teach him all those years ago, that real wealth isn't measured in bank accounts, but in connections, in community, in the simple act of making someone else's day a little bit brighter. I don't know if we'll ever be a real family again. The scars run too deep, the betrayal cuts too close to the bone. But maybe that's not the point. Maybe the point is that we're trying. Maybe the point is that love, real love, doesn't give up, even when it has every reason to. And every morning, when I unlock the door to Morning Haven Collective, I touch Grandma's picture and whisper the same words Grandpa used to say. Love served daily, no exceptions, no matter how much it hurts. Because in the end, that's all we really have. That's all that really matters. Love, served daily, even to the people who break our hearts, even to the family members who forget what family means, even to ourselves, when we're too tired and too hurt and too angry to remember why we keep fighting. Grandpa was right about everything. Legacy isn't what you leave behind. It's what you teach someone to carry forward. And what he taught me, what he's still teaching me, even now, is that love is the only business worth staying in, no matter how much it costs, no matter how much it hurts, no matter how many times it gets thrown back in your face. The steam still rises from the coffee cups every morning, forming shapes in the air that look like hope, like possibility, like second chances floating on the breeze. And somewhere, I know Grandpa and Grandma are watching, smiling, proud that their little cafe became something bigger than they ever dreamed, not because of the money or the success, but because it became a place where broken people can learn to heal, where families can remember what they're supposed to mean to each other, where love gets served daily with a side of forgiveness and a promise that tomorrow can always be better than yesterday. In every cup you serve forgiveness too. That's what Grandpa would say if he were here. That's what he is saying, through the steam and the memories and the endless possibility that exists when people choose love over everything else that tries to tear them apart.